I suspect that it is this generalization of man, this abstract concept of humanity, this segregation of the reasoning mind from the complex of emotions and intuitions, which has led to so many generalized economic theories which treat individuals only as units for statistics and parts of averages. In turn, this statistical approach encourages the idea that people can be tucked away in neat categories of such things as income group, technical or professional qualifications or class, that once in a category for one purpose, they're in the same category for all purposes. One of the consequences of generalization is that issues become confused. For instance, it makes it possible to equate group or national independence with liberty of the individual. In practice, these are very different indeed, as I suspect the people of several of the more recently independent countries have discovered to their cost. Furthermore, it suggests certain groups are automatically composed of undesirable and antisocial characters, while others are inevitably full of saint-like creatures. Even a very limited experience of human nature reveals the fallacy of any such idea. Generalization of this sort is enjoying a great vogue in this country at the moment. There is much talk of wealth creation and distribution, the importance of engineering and manufacturing, and such abstract concepts as labour and management, and that most nebulous of all generalizations, the national economy. All these things are nothing more than convenient labels. They are sums, percentages, or averages of individual activity. But you cannot change the activity of individuals simply by demanding changes to the sum of their activities. For instance, engineering does not create the engineer. The engineering is created by people with particular talents and ambitions. That is not to say that individuals cannot act corporately. In some cases, the individual can avoid responsibility by pleading loyalty to a group. On the other hand, membership of a group with a strong sense of service can induce a higher standard of behavior in an individual than he could achieve on his own. Perhaps the most significant development in the mankind stream of philosophy was inspired, if not directly enunciated, by Hegel. In effect, philosophy was no longer to be considered simply as an attempt to interpret human history or to influence human behavior, but as a deliberate endeavour to influence the future of mankind as a whole by transforming what are believed to be rational concepts into practical structures. As Marx put it in a frequently quoted passage, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And it is this direct and dominant association of an aggressive philosophy with politics and administration which distinguishes the Marxist socialist type of government systems which are derived from it. The other stream of philosophy seems to come down through the Old Testament prophets and perhaps the sophists, and then through Christ and Muhammad, as far as Europe and the Middle East are concerned, and through the Buddha further east. The general concept of this stream seems to be that in the normal course of events, the world is at best a neutral, if not an actively wicked place, which can only be made tolerable by the commitment of individuals to what is good and right. It holds that it is not the structures and organizations of states or groups which dictate the fate of nations, but the cumulative effect of its individual members, each acting during his limited lifespan under the compulsion of a religious and moral code of practice. In this stream, there is every latitude for the individual to exercise responsibility in whatever legitimate way he may choose, always provided he shows concern for the unfortunate and consideration to all men. However, the individual-orientated systems are dependent for their success on the voluntary acceptance, by at least a large majority, of certain standards of human behavior and relationship to one another. As these standards have to be inculcated into every child of every succeeding generation, it is obviously impossible to maintain these standards at a uniformly high level at all times and in all sections of the community. Furthermore, there will always be a proportion of the population which inevitably loses out in the competitive scramble for material survival, and whose situation is made to look even worse by those who have been particularly successful. Then there are those who simply do not wish to conform to the accepted philosophy, and these have certainly been cruelly persecuted from time to time. But both the disadvantages and the intolerance have always been contrary to the basic precepts of this stream of philosophy. In the Plato-Marxist stream, on the other hand, there is no room for those who disagree with the system, or who cannot bring themselves to believe that the state is anything other than a bunch of fallible and ambitious mortals whose sole justification for their monopoly of power is that they claim to know better than their fellow citizens, and are prepared to use any means to enforce conformity. In exchange for conforming, the claim is made, though not always substantiated in practice, that no one need suffer from sheer material misfortune. It is easy enough to show that in purely statistical terms, the bulk of the populations living under either system enjoy largely comparable material standards. The real difference only becomes apparent when you compare the state of the disadvantaged, in the first case due to such things as unemployment and various forms of material deprivation, as against police harassment, concentration camps, and the loss of freedom of speech and of enterprise. Sins of omission against sins of commission. As might have been expected, the politically orientated philosophies maintain that class, religion, private property, and the division of labour are the causes of all mankind's troubles, while the moral or religious philosophies claim that the love of money is the root of all evil. In consequence, the former advocate economic solutions and material egalitarianism, while the latter are concerned with spiritual egalitarianism, or equality before God and the law, and the salvation of the individual soul through charity, humility, and self-control. It's perhaps symptomatic that the former is accused of denying human rights, while the latter is accused of denying social justice. The former believes in revolution and conversion by violence, while the latter hopes to achieve a spiritual revolution in the minds of individuals. It's worth remembering that more people have renounced violence, wealth, and material comfort for the sake of their God than they have for the sake of their political party. The trouble seems to be that the solutions put forward by the materialist philosophers and economic theorists have caused as many problems as they claim to have solved. Indeed, in many cases, decisions dictated by theory and subjective assessment have been shown in practice to have exactly the opposite effect to that intended. It is quite possible that the conditions in manufacturing industry 150 years ago caused alienation and dehumanization. The danger today appears to be that the sheer volume of legislation and the inflexibility of bureaucratic structures are creating a similar sense of alienation and the dehumanization of individuals by the all-powerful and impersonal state. It may well be that the whole discussion about participation and the wish to be involved in decision-making at work has stemmed from the erosion of the ability of individuals to participate in their domestic decision-making as citizens and parents. One major factor which all the politically and economically orientated philosophers have had to contend with, and which many of them have used as a criticism of their opponents, is that views and analyses are inevitably influenced by personal experience, and particularly by the social and economic conditions prevailing at the time they were formulated. In other words, there has always been the danger that circumstances might change and so render their ideas and remedies irrelevant. In philosophies dealing with human nature and personal behaviour, on the other hand, the central subject has not changed in any marked degree during recorded history, and is no more likely to do so in the future. On the whole, it seems that the weakness of the materialist system comes from a disregard for the spirit of men, while that in the spiritual system is claimed to be an apparent inability to provide for the material needs of the poor and the handicapped. While it looks as if the former can only be cured by a considerable shift in the state philosophy, no system has been able to do more than to alleviate the latter, and then only by a combination of administrative measures, public funds, and voluntary service. Yet, in general terms, there really is no great argument about intentions. Both systems are equally committed in principle to the welfare of all mankind, and both find their particular groups of disadvantage a considerable embarrassment. Both are deeply concerned to remove the disadvantages, in the one case by finding means of relieving poverty and handicap, and in the other by all sorts of attempts to convert intellectual opposition into conformity and support. Both agree about the desirability of a so-called democratic system, but as they interpret the meaning of the word in different senses, they disagree fundamentally on the structure of the government system, and the consequent relationship between the state and the people, and of the state and the individual. In one respect at least, things could be easier for future generations in that, given that they have any choice at all in the matter, they will be able to compare systems of government derived from both streams of philosophy in practical operation. They will, in all probability, ignore it, but the evidence will be there for all to see that the one system has not been able to deliver the promised utopia in the present world, while the other may not be able to prove that everlasting bliss will be achieved in the world to come. But at least it puts the blame for present ills where it belongs, on people and not on structures. Whatever their technical and scientific achievements, I suspect that the problems of managing and governing men will continue to plague every generation. But my guess is that finding workable solutions to these problems has not been made any easier by those philosophers who have claimed to have found the one all-embracing solution to the problems of the whole of mankind. Paradoxically, the materialist line of reasoning has contributed a great deal to our understanding of the development of some human communities and civilizations. But there is little evidence to suggest that the lot of men has been greatly improved either spiritually or materially by the implementation of the theories of the materialist philosophers. Their erudition and cleverness is not in doubt, but it would seem that their understanding of the practical facts of human existence was perhaps rather more limited, and their faith in the nobler aspects of human nature almost non-existent. Equally, there is no doubt about their good intentions, but somehow or other their oversimplification of the issues seems to have stimulated an unwarranted confidence in the effectiveness of the political and administrative systems which are derived from their ideas. This rather self-righteous paternalism has in turn created a bitter political confrontation and alienation between government bureaucracies and the private citizen. It was clearly never intended to create such arbitrary and damaging divisions in human society. And now that experience seems to suggest that they hold out little promise of achieving greater social harmony and cooperation, perhaps it is time for a new initiative in the development of political philosophies. In the 150 years since Marx developed his ideas, the world has experienced a series of industrial, social, and scientific explosions, which have created the modern urban industrial civilizations, within wholly new material and intellectual environments, and with a wholly new dimension in living standards. Many of the old problems still remain, but these new circumstances would appear to demand a new analysis and a new set of directions for the future, taking into account the present levels of public education and reflecting a better appreciation of the state of medical and scientific knowledge in the latter part of the 20th century. It is now 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, and practices in industrial and commercial enterprises have come a very long way in that time, and any new thinking should be firmly based on a realistic assessment of the best and most successful of them. But above all, we must never again allow any system to ignore both the best or the worst in human nature. There is every reason to believe that human nature will remain much as it always has been, which means that such classic problems as selfishness and dishonesty, cheating and exploitation, crime and punishment, unscrupulous ambition and corruption in public administration are likely to continue to provide headaches for every community for as long as this planet is able to support its load of humanity. But these more sordid features need to be balanced against the genuine kindliness and concern, the generosity and self-denial which is to be found in so many more people in all walks of life, and particularly against the limitless capacity of people to respond to the inspiration of religious and moral teaching. Of one thing I'm absolutely convinced: there cannot be any satisfactory future for the so-called silent majority if the elements of philosophy, politics and administration remain out of balance and continue to create conflict and confrontation between governments and people. In the early 70s, when Robin Woods, later to become Bishop of Worcester, was Dean of Windsor, he created a discussion centre in St George's House out of two large and redundant canons' houses. The purpose was to give people in positions of responsibility and the leaders of thought and opinion an opportunity to discuss contemporary issues with members of the clergy and to allow the clergy to become better informed about lay opinion. In 1977, Dean Michael Mann had the idea of instituting an annual lecture to be given in St George's Chapel as a complement to the themes under discussion in St George's House. Mr. Kingman Brewster, distinguished academic and university administrator, and at the time the United States Ambassador in London, gave the first lecture, which he called the Entitlement Society, in 1978. The second was given by Mr. Paul Marc Henry, who spoke about changing standards in society. As I'd only been asked to take the chair on both occasions, it came as rather a nasty shock when the Dean suggested that I should give the third lecture. I agreed with the best grace I could manage, and in April 1980 I addressed the audience in St George's Chapel on the subject of one aspect of human conflict. There is a classic, if depressing, law that bad news always drives out good news, and the worse the news, the more space it takes up. As a consequence, incidents and events tend to be given much more coverage than the issues themselves. There is a danger, I know, of getting what we call disasters out of proportion, simply because they are going on in our lifetime. Yet somehow the impression persists that what is going on today is different in some way from previous experience. It seems to me that in recent years man's inhumanity to man has developed a wholly new and a different quality. There seems to have been a remarkable sameness about so much of the violence. The language of justification, the techniques of intimidation and terrorism, the source of weapons, and perhaps most obvious of all, the political structure and style adopted by successful revolutionaries and liberation armies. They all appear to have a quite remarkable family likeness. This disturbing similarity may be due once again to modern communications, which so easily spread the philosophy and language of conflict and revolution from one part of the world to another, and revolutionaries tend to be just as conformist as any other group. There may well be other reasons, but it is surely a curious coincidence that sooner or later, with only a few exceptions, it becomes apparent that at the heart of the terrorist campaign, or of the Liberation Army, or of the revolutionary movement, or of civil unrest, there is a hard core of Marxists. Furthermore, it cannot be entirely coincidence that wherever such a state of conflict exists, the terrorists, liberators, or revolutionaries are almost invariably supported by money, arms, or men and women from countries under Marxist regimes. It therefore seems difficult to avoid the conclusion that the family likeness in so much of modern conflict is, in fact, the likeness of Marx, though, to be fair, it is very doubtful that Marx himself would have been proud of everything that has been perpetrated in his name. But this is a factor he has to share with all political and religious leaders. Certainly there are distinctions to be drawn between Marxism, communism, socialism, Leninism, Trotskyism, Stalinism, and probably several other isms. But I think it is generally accepted that they are all either related to or derived from Marx's analysis and ideology. In much the same way, Christianity covers a multitude of variants of the Christian faith. There are, of course, plenty of famous philosophers in the history of the world, men who have given us a better understanding of ourselves, of our natures, and of our curious situation in this universe. Some of them became great religious leaders, whose influence on morality and on attitudes and beliefs was strong enough to transform men's behavior and to change their social and political existence. Although their individual teaching varies considerably in detail, in general terms they were agreed about the virtues of love, peace, tolerance, and brotherhood, and the most successful of them still number their followers in hundreds of millions. Even if Marx never thought of himself as the founder of a religion, the fact remains that his achievement in terms of the numbers of his followers, the number of people who have been attracted by his ideas, and the impact he has made on the pattern of human existence is certainly on the same scale. The salient points of Marx's life are worth mentioning. He was born in Trier in the Rhineland in 1818, descended on his father's side from a family of eminent rabbis. His father was a prosperous lawyer in the Prussian service who chose to become a Lutheran in 1824. His mother was of Hungarian origin and, strangely enough, never learned to speak or read German. Marx himself studied at the universities of Bonn and Berlin, which in the conditions of the time implies a degree of family affluence. Initially he took up law, but soon drifted into philosophy and joined what might be described as the mainstream of militant European socialism, dominated at that time by the materialism of Feuerbach and the dialectic of Hegel. This led to political journalism and agitation, and consequently to the necessity for fairly frequent moves from one country to another. In London in 1847 he joined the League of Communists, for whom he and his friend Engels composed the Communist Manifesto. Engels, incidentally, was the son of a German cotton manufacturer with factories in England. He then spent the last 34 years of his life with his aristocratic wife, Jenny von Westphalen, and their family in Soho, almost entirely dependent on whatever support Engels was able to provide. His literary output was considerable, but most of his later years were occupied in completing the manuscript of Das Kapital, which he considered to be his main work. Only the first volume was published in his lifetime. The other two volumes were brought out by Engels after his death. There's nothing very extraordinary about this story. The general pattern of his life was not untypical of any number of middle-class intellectuals, and he exhibited many of their characteristics. He appears to have had an enormous capacity for painstaking work, a vivid and forceful literary style, considerable imagination, and a single-minded devotion to a particular philosophy. His weakness, if that is the appropriate word for it, seems to have been a hopelessly unrealistic understanding of human nature. His obsession with science and scientific socialism, with materialism and dialectics, and with academic research, seems to have blinded him to the power, variety, and irrational nature of human emotions and talents, and to the fact that such qualities of human nature are equally distributed among all people, regardless of class or intellect. Compare Karl Marx's life story with that of Jesus Christ. Disregarding for a moment the divine element, I think it would be fair to say that Jesus was born apparently out of wedlock to a temporarily homeless artisan. He narrowly escaped political murder as a baby and was brought up as a carpenter who spent his life preaching love and forgiveness. Eventually, this man of peace was arrested, tortured, and tried in secret against Jewish law for preaching that God is love. He was condemned to a criminal's death. Perhaps most astonishing of all is that he left nothing in writing. In modern terms, he might be described as an underprivileged, colonial, working-class victim of political and religious persecution. Yet, he only sought to influence men in their behavior towards each other through their belief in God, and promised paradise in the next world, whereas the middle-class intellectuals sought absolute political power and expected to achieve paradise in this world. It is a further irony that the man who institutionalized class warfare and glorified totalitarianism should have lived out his life in the safety of a tolerant and peaceful and democratic society, while the man who worked so hard to heal divisions and reconcile enemies should have met such a violent end in what was virtually a theocratic state. One of the major difficulties about trying to assess Marx's ideas is that they seem to be composed of two separate and distinct elements. One is a scholarly and extensively researched analysis of economic and social history, which resulted in the development of the theory of historical materialism. The other is the promotion of a subjective ideology based on the conviction that one vaguely defined group of people was responsible for all the world's social and economic problems. Unfortunately, both elements are woven into his works in such a way that it's very difficult to unravel them into their distinctive parts. The trouble is that no matter how honestly, zealously, or objectively people may seek it, it is only to be expected that they will arrive at different estimates of the truth, depending on their analysis of the evidence they choose to use, on their deductive powers, and on their judgment. Marx, like many before and since his time, went to considerable lengths to make his selection of facts fit his particular theories. After all, if every one of us were capable of grasping the whole truth about particular aspects of human existence, as easily as we can grasp the difference between male and female, or that 2 + 2 = 4, there would be no discussion about such things as politics and religion, and economic analysts would always be right. It's also important to bear in mind that Marx, like any other political writer, was inevitably influenced by the ideas of his predecessors and by the social, economic, and industrial attitudes and the conditions of his time, as well as by the intellectual fashions of his contemporaries. This is particularly important because, while the basic elements of human nature have remained much the same, social and economic conditions are constantly changing and evolving. To begin with, it is worth remembering that the French Revolution and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had taken place only a relatively short time before he was born. The one had shown that an apparently stable and entrenched regime could be overthrown by violence. The other was to demonstrate that pre-industrial society in Europe was coming to an end. Secondly, by the time Marx was learning and observing, the Industrial Revolution in Britain was quite well advanced, and as with all revolutions, its progress was marked by all kinds of excesses, unexpected developments, including a population explosion, and wholly new situations with which the existing forms of social and political organization were virtually unable to cope. The consequence was to accentuate the differences between the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the helpless, and the controllers and controlled. However, you cannot very well have something like half the rural population moving into the cities and expect housing, sanitation, schools, hospitals, and all the other social infrastructure to appear overnight. The wonder is that so much appeared as quickly as it did. Nor can you give the enterprising people new opportunities to make their fortunes, and the more ordinary people the chance to earn comparatively high wages, and expect them to consider with much care all the implications of their eagerness to grasp them. It seems to be one of the unfortunate rules of human nature that whenever people get onto a good thing, they promptly overdo it. Selfishness and thoughtlessness are more to blame than malice. Equally, you cannot have new industrial enterprises with previously unheard-of methods of manufacture springing up like mushrooms and expect Parliament to enact appropriate legislation for their control at the same speed. Even Marx acknowledges that the situation in Britain would have been much worse but for the efforts of reformers in Parliament and the findings of commissions of inquiry into the worst scandals and excesses. It is therefore extremely unlikely that conditions at the middle stages of any revolution are any certain guide to what things will be like when the revolution has run its course. This is particularly true of the Industrial Revolution, which brought about more radical changes to human lifestyle than any previous period in history. Yet Marx picked on the nastiest features of industrial life in the middle of this revolution and based on them a general theory for all human behavior, past, present, and future. One of the consequences of the general process of economic and social evolution, which included the breakup of the feudal system, the enclosure of common land, and the Industrial Revolution, was the large increase in the number of wage labourers employed either by landlords or by factory owners. Marx believed very strongly that it was impossible to have a satisfactory society where there was such a crude division between those who owned property and capital and those who had nothing but their wages. Naturally, in a purely static situation, this would be intolerable, but no human system is static, and the freer the system, the more quickly the self-correcting mechanism works, and the greater the movement between classes is likely to be. Furthermore, while it is quite true that the difference between those two groups was very great in Marx's time, the fact is that they occupied the extreme ends of a very wide social spectrum, with any number of economic groups in between, and it so happens that subsequent evolutionary changes in non-Marxist countries has narrowed this gap very considerably. Marx lived through the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and many of his judgments were made on the basis of the contemporary situation in England. But he was also particularly influenced by Darwin and by the general intellectual atmosphere of his time. Theism had given way to legalism, which in turn had given way to liberalism, anti-clericalism, rationalism, and utilitarianism. There was a utopian belief that every human problem could be solved by scientific analysis and the operation of altruistic human will. All that was necessary was to identify and eradicate the cause of the problem, and everything would immediately become all sweetness and light. Marx was convinced that he had achieved all this in his theory of historical materialism.